But so what God asks of us then, the fundamental issue, is, won't you please accept being a creature? Because there's no other way we can relate. I created you. If you do that, which involves a sense of our nothingness without God, then all your personal history and all your accomplishments and all your failures are absorbed or immersed or extinguished in the reality of actually participating in God's life, which is the definition of grace. So that you will be looking out of God's eyes. You will be relating with God's love, heart to heart, with every creature, appropriately to their level of consciousness. And you will have those dispositions of forgiveness, compassion without limit, practical helping of others, concern, gentleness, incredible love, deeper than any passion can go. All this, God would give you everything, everything, if we could just accept being nothing. Once you accept it, you don't have to think about it anymore. But you do really have to accept it, and that, at least up until this point in human evolution, has required trials, difficulties, disasters, dark nights, disappointments, and death. All of them are not there for their own sake or because nature is just stupid. They're serving the most essential purposes of opposing in us those dispositions of self-centeredness and selfishness, isolation, forgetfulness of God, that is a result largely, or most of all, of our lack of evolution on the levels of consciousness. So as those levels begin to stabilize, like intuitive, unitive, and unity itself, and beyond that, there's no limit to the growth that is possible in a life and love that is infinite. Okay. There's no limit to new insights into reality. But anyway, we won't leave behind the wonderful relationships we had on earth or our loved ones, but we'll be seeing them through the eyes of God, in whom they are much more beautiful than we could ever see them. And so this is a win-win situation, but the condition is tough. Not because it's that. Why can't you say, well, I'm nothing, so what? I'm happy. It's not that easy. Are you really willing to accept what happens as it is? And you have to do something about it. Death is really, to accept death is to accept God, because it's the way to become no thing, no attachment to any of our roles, history, accomplishments, even loved ones. The person on the edge of death doesn't stop loving his loved ones, but sees them from a new point, and is absorbed in moving to a new level of perception that sees everyone in God and God in everyone else, including ourselves. So it's not so much physical penance that matters. It's the humility that is willing to be nothing. And so Jesus says in that saying, anyone who brings themselves to nothing, no thing, any possessive attitude involves possessiveness in some degree. So it's the willingness to let everything go. To love everything is God's gift. but also to let it all go as God's greater gift in order to enter the world that is, and is continuously going to become more and more whatever that plan might be. So, centering prayer, dear folks, is a distinct choice of becoming nothing. Because that's all you do in centering prayer, is not to think, not to do, but just to be. Well, of course, habits of a lifetime keep sending up thoughts and feelings, and our concerns from everyday life keep intruding. So, you might say that centering prayer is itself a process that leads to unity with God. If you keep doing it, and if you are detached from experiences of God, or even from the method, at some point you have to let your word or your breath, because you're in the house of God anyway, you don't have to say anything or do anything. You're already there. You'd have to do those things in the beginning because you're always doing something else. So you reprogram yourself. But you have to go beyond all the programming, all the methods, and just be. And be what? No thing. That is, no object and no subject, but just being. This is as close as you can get to God, because this is what He does, apparently. So if you sit down to do this practice, you really are changing your life in the sense of your dispositions and your reasons for living, and the way that you treat others that might need to stand improvement. Because the thing that is most important about everybody else is God dwells in them too. And they're in this house, and we have the same source and destiny, and basically the same almost infinite needs. Our capacity. What is a capacity? It's the openness to whatever you want to put in it. And so if it's a doggy bag, well, don't have the doggy in there if you want to have something be filled with grace. So the centering prayer then, if you continue doing so, and perhaps as you have time and are a little older, increase a little bit the time that you spend at being nothing, or just being. It doesn't mean completely nothing. It's not about annihilation, although some mystics speak of that, but annihilation kind of frightens most people today. Nothing to be afraid of. You'd be better off. Being nothing is the edge of being everything. Because once you really detached from your subjective or objective relationships with objects, you can move to being in relationship with being. And this is really who we are. We're being too, in the sense of becoming. And so the dispositions that go with centering prayer are based on the structure of the practice, which starts with external silence. When you stop thinking, at least intentionally, you're into solitude. Because if you're still thinking, your mind is cluttered with all kinds of things. It could be noisier than if you were downtown Manhattan or someplace. So silence moves, I'm talking about dispositions now, into solitude, which moves into stillness. Now stillness is on the edge of contemplative prayer. And this, as John of the Cross says, is the inflowing of the ultimate reality into our souls. It's not us who do this. That's why contemplative prayer is always looked at as a gift, but unfortunately people think, well, it's a big gift, it's hard to get. But it isn't. It's actually something that's a gift that has been given, so that just by being human one has this capacity. So much so that some mystics today are saying that contemplation is the natural state for human beings. That is to say, to be aware of the house that they're in. The presence of God has many different words to describe it because it's infinite. So the beloved then is dealing with us at every moment exactly where we are. So we have to start there too and deal with God as exactly as we are now. But we don't know how to do that without the gradual enlightenment of our conscience, so that we see the obstacles in us or our overly animal failure to evolve. So we're still responding. Violence is a classical example of an animal reaction to conflict, but it's not the human reaction. People just haven't grown up enough to be able to handle that, where the answer to violence is forgiveness, compassion, and to do more to heal the wounds in ourselves that hinder love, rather than trying to correct something. Obviously, there's some situations that are still so animal on the social level, you have to do something to restrain some of the more animal folks. But we could probably help even mental people or criminals if we worked a little harder on our own loving, whatever in us hinders infinite compassion, okay, or the mercy that we know we have received and are receiving. Well, anyway, as these dispositions stabilize, they change you, so that at some point you may not recognize who you were as a young person or an adolescent, and there's no inclination to do so, because you're climbing out with God's help, or the Spirit is doing this for you, and so the consent begins to turn into surrender, and surrender can turn into union and unity. Each of these is a separate state of consciousness beyond rationality. So once again, you sit down and you choose to let go of yourself into the presence of God, with whatever insight you have into your own weaknesses that tend to become clearer as you gain humility and practice and confidence in God. So at a certain point, if you try to anticipate the future, we could be a little discouraged because we know we're not there yet. But all you have to do is be where you are and cultivate those things that are appropriate, and some discipline, some practice is important. But it should be congruent with our duties and daily life and so on. And it's not that hard. But we've been taught from the beginning of life that it's very hard or practically impossible. Or you have to go to a monastery to get a good start on this, or you have to give up this or that. That's not the issue, because you can do all of those things for the wrong motive, for a motive of self-accomplishment as an ascetic, for instance, or to be a great contemplative. And in any case, Christ says he's taken away all our sins, so they're not an issue once you regret them and are sorry. And we don't have the power to change under ourselves, so we have to turn ourselves over to him. There's a few sayings in the gospel that suggest this. And remember when Christ, was it the time he cried over Jerusalem, he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who slay the prophets. How often, how much I long to take you to myself as a hen," notice the feminine image here, "gathers her chicks under her wings." In other words, he's prepared to mother us if only we're not something else than a little chick or something very insignificant. Yeah, so as I said, this to complete the stages, you might say, that some of them are reflected in the Contemplative Outreach logo, but silence, solitude, stillness. Then what comes? Solidarity. Solidarity, meaning if you do those first three, you begin to see your oneness with everyone else, and that everyone is equal, basically, and that competition, maybe apart from making a living, is absurd, because we all have the same problems, and we need to help each other get out of the swamp of human failure to evolve into fully human dispositions, and to keep regressing in temptation or crisis to purely animal responses to conflict. So as I think I said last year, the cross is the symbol of the human condition, crucified between heaven and earth, in the sense that here we are with our human consciousness. We can't go back to the irresponsibility of the animals. We know we're responsible for certain choices. And we can't go forward into this life of grace and transformation on our own strength. So to accept that situation is itself an enormous worship of God, an acceptance of God, acceptance of His plan, and a huge leap forward in the spiritual journey, to be able to accept our slice of the human condition, which is, up till now, the failure to evolve fully into rational consciousness, which I suspect can only be done if you move on to intuitive and unitive states, so that you can see the limitations of rationality, even while you admire its extraordinary capacities that we see in the technological age in a special way. So after solidarity comes service. Now the service is coming not from some ego trip or some emotional involvement in however good these are as a starting point. But now they're arising from a spontaneous disposition that invites us practically to respond to the needs of our neighbor, or to say what would be helpful in a certain situation that we might not have thought about it. In other words, we're sufficiently aware of our insertion in the house and our union with God that even our ordinary diverse activities on the humble levels of human existence are inspired, are beginning to be. And so God is experiencing the triumph of changing matter itself into divine love in our persons. So God has a huge stake in this. And any response is going to bring his help and skill to completing the work. And what would be the completion? Well, beyond surface that's inspired by the love of God, which is the fulfillment of the second commandment of the Old Testament, to love your neighbor as yourself. and raised to a higher level of intensity. But Christ's example in which he said, love one another as I have loved you, which is complete. And then might come simplicity, which is the union of prayer and action, so that even in enormous activity and distraction and concern, you never forget you're in the house. In other words, the house or the womb, if we're using that metaphor, are so much a part of our consciousness that the two begin to go on at the same time. So you never lose the presence, and the presence is always inviting us into the heart and to allow all our actions to come from love of neighbor or from divine love. And simplicity is the union of contemplation and action, and it's the way God's nature is. So it's to become God-like, to be able to be at rest and in immense activity for the love of God at the same time. This is what God is doing all the time. And then simplicity finally is invited to become unity, which is to be God. Not obviously in the sense of numerically one with God's almighty power, but to be one, I guess, psychologically and spiritually, so there's no remembrance of being anything but God. One has acknowledged being a creature, that's all it was asked. And when you fully can do that, then God wants you perhaps to forget even that. So in taking the path of self-surrender through a practice like centering prayer, you are courageously and taking a path that is not exactly a free way or a through way, but which is the way to divine union. No self in the sense of attachment. So the Spirit prompts us then to be what He is, or she is, or it is. There are no genders in regard to the Spirit as far as I know. And this is teaching us or assimilating us to the divine way of acting. And these are expressed in the fruits, gifts of the Spirit, and the Beatitudes. And an increased joy in the sacrifice of giving ourselves to God.